Baseball is a game of generations. Each decade brings with it a new era, new rules, new styles, and most importantly, new legends. And when we look back throughout history, there's always one player who rises above the rest. One guy who didn't just dominate for a year or two, but owned an entire decade. Today we'll be looking at the best position player from every decade from the 1870s to the 2020s so far. I'll be taking into account numbers, accolades, postseason success, and overall value to try to find the best from each decade. Be sure to subscribe to see the best pitcher from each decade coming soon. Before we jump to the more familiar eras, I want to briefly touch on the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. These decades were so far back, like no gloves, underhand pitching, and trains as team buses kind of far, that the game was still figuring out what it even was. Stats weren't always reliable, seasons were short, and there wasn't even a World Series yet. But there were still a few standout players who completely dominated their time, and they deserve a quick spotlight before we hit the more modern era. 1870s, Ross Barnes. If you're talking about the best player of baseball's earliest years, the name is Ross Barnes. In the 1870s, when pitchers still threw underhand and bats looked like broomsticks, Barnes was miles ahead of everyone else. He led the league in batting average, on base percentage, runs, and total bases multiple times, and in 1876, the first National League season, he hit .429 and basically broke the sport. He was the first great offensive player in pro baseball, and for that first decade, no one else was even close. 1880s, Dan Brothers. The 1880s belonged to Dan Brothers, baseball's first true slugger. He didn't just hit, he crushed the ball in an era where power was nearly non-existent. Brothers led the league in slugging percentage 6 times, batting average 5 times, and consistently finished at or near the top in OPS and RBI. He was putting up 350 plus batting averages when most hitters were happy to reach 270. His dominance wasn't a fluke, it lasted the entire decade, and he was feared every time he stepped into the box. Now, Cap Anson absolutely deserves a mention here too. He was one of the most consistent and influential hitters of the 19th century, and his career numbers are staggering for the era. But while Anson was steady across multiple decades, Brothers had the higher peak and led more key offensive categories in the 1880s. 1890s, Billy Hamilton. The 1890s were all about chaos on the base paths, and Billy Hamilton was the king of that chaos. And no, it's not that Billy Hamilton. Sliding Billy was a leadoff nightmare, blazing fast, relentlessly aggressive, and an on-base machine. In the 1890s, Hamilton batted .340 and had a .466 on-base percentage, stole over 600 bases, and scored more than 1,000 runs. He had multiple seasons with 190 runs scored, numbers that don't even sound real. He changed how teams approached the top of the lineup and became the prototype for the modern leadoff hitter. The 1900s, Honus Wagner. When you think of early baseball, you probably picture guys with handlebar mustaches and elite baseball names, as well as a lack of home runs. This was the dead ball era, when home runs were rare and games were scrappy, but there were still legends, and none bigger than Honus Wagner. Known as the Flying Dutchman, Wagner was everything you'd want in a player before the game had stars. He was a shortstop who hit for average, had surprising pop, stole tons of bases, and fielded like a vacuum. From 1900 to 1909, he led the league in batting 6 times, in OPS 6 times, in RBIs 5 times, and even led the league in steals on multiple occasions. He wasn't just consistent, he was an absolute force. And it wasn't empty production either. Wagner was the backbone of a dominant Pirates team that went to the very first modern World Series in 1903, and in 1909, he helped lead them to a championship once again. In fact, he was so dominant and so far ahead of his peers that the rarest baseball card in history, the T206 Honus Wagner, is still considered the holy grail of the hobby and was the subject of a Nickelodeon TV movie called Swindle in the early 2010s. No one dominated this era like Honus Wagner, except maybe on the pitching side Christy Mathewson was pretty dominant. But anyway, this is just position players. 1910s, Ty Cobb. The 1910s were a different kind of chaos, still in the dead ball era, but with more stars starting to emerge, and no one played with more intensity or fury than Ty Cobb. Cobb was a menace on the base paths and a once-in-a-generation hitter. He was someone who absolutely terrified pitchers. From 1910 to 1919, he had a combined .382. Yep, that's not a mistake, .382 for an entire decade. He led the league in batting average 7 times during those 10 years, and in 1911 he hit .420 with 248 hits and 127 RBIs, and that was all without hitting a single home run over the fence. That's how different the game was, and how different Cobb was. But he wasn't just hitting singles, he led the league in slugging percentage 4 times, stolen bases 6 times, and total bases 5 times. The mental game was part of his weaponry, as Cobb thrived in getting in people's heads. 1920s, Babe Ruth. There's no debate here, the 1920s didn't just belong to Babe Ruth, he changed baseball forever. Before Ruth, baseball was about bunts, stolen bases, and just playing small ball every game. Home runs were pretty rare. But then Babe showed up with a bat like a sledgehammer and rewrote the rules. In 1920, his first full season with the Yankees, he hit 54 home runs, more than every other team in the league, and that was just the beginning. He hit 59 home runs the next year, then 60 in 1927, and that record would stand until 1961. He didn't just break home run records, he obliterated them. He didn't do it as a one-dimensional slugger either. He hit over 350 multiple times in the decade, drove in runs by the truckload, and had an on-base percentage that would make modern analytics nerds weep tears of joy.
Why do you like him?
As Billy Beane said,
"Because he gets on base."
with Ruth, the Yankees became the Yankees. They won 3 World Series in the 20s and built a dynasty on his back. His popularity went beyond baseball as he was an international icon loved across America and even countries like Japan. He's still considered the greatest of all time by many and has probably the most aura we've ever seen in baseball. Try to think of a classic baseball movie that doesn't at least mention Babe Ruth. He hasn't stepped on a baseball field in 90 years and is still talked about regularly. As for other greats in the 20s, Rogers Hornsby was unbelievable too. He hit over 400 3 times in this decade and had power to boot. But this was Babe Ruth's decade, and I don't think anyone would argue that. 1930s, Lou Gehrig. The 1930s were a golden age for hitters, offense was booming, and first base was loaded with talent. But when you stack it all up, no one combined elite production, consistency, and winning quite like Lou Gehrig. The 1930s were Gehrig's prime, the decade where the Iron Horse didn't just play every day, he dominated every day. From 1930 through 1937, he averaged .341 at the plate, hit over 36 home runs per year, and drove in more than 140 runs annually. In 1931, he drove in a ridiculous 185 runs, a number that's still one of the highest single-season totals in MLB history. Then in 1934, he went a step further and won the Triple Crown, batting .363 with 49 homers and 165 RBIs. He also led the league in on-base percentage and slugging. You know how rare it is to win the Triple Crown, and Gehrig made it look casual, but it wasn't just the regular season. Lou Gehrig was the anchor of a dynasty. In the 1930s alone, he helped lead the Yankees to 5 World Series titles, 1932, 1936, 1937, 1938, and 1939, although this was the year he famously retired, but he still did play and the Yankees won the World Series that year. And the Yankees weren't just winning, they were steamrolling the competition. They swept 4 of those 5 series. Gehrig hit .361 across his postseason career with big moments in every October. He homered in the 1932 World Series, the same series as the famous Babe Ruth called shot, and by the late 1930s, he was the unquestioned leader of the Yankees as Ruth passed the torch and a young Joe DiMaggio arrived. Now it's true Jimmy Foxx was a monster during the same stretch, 3 MVPs, a Triple Crown as well, huge power numbers, but while Foxx had the flashier peaks, Gehrig was just relentlessly excellent year in and year out and had a lot more team success. And of course, his streak of 2,130 consecutive games began in 1925 and rolled right through most of the decade. Rain, shine, injury just didn't matter. Gehrig showed up and he produced every single day. You can honestly go either way here, and I actually was about to choose Jimmy Foxx at first, but I ultimately decided on Gehrig due to the numbers being close, but Gehrig being part of a dynasty. And even beyond baseball, Lou Gehrig was a great human being, and his legacy lives on all these years later. If you haven't seen Pride of the Yankees, I highly recommend it. 1940s, Ted Williams. The 1940s were complicated. World War II robbed the game of countless prime seasons, but even with 3 years lost to military service, Ted Williams still outclassed everyone. Let's start with 1941, the year Williams hit .406, and that was the last time anyone has touched the 400 mark. And he didn't do it with weak contact or bloop singles. He led the league in slugging and on base percentage and walks. He was the complete hitter. Then right after his prime seasons, he lost 3 seasons due to military service, and then he immediately won MVP again. He just stepped back in the batter's box like nothing changed. In the 1940s, Williams won 2 MVPs, led the league in OPS 5 times, and was the most feared hitter in baseball despite missing those 3 full seasons. Now Stan Musial was right there with them, more games played and more championships, and if the numbers were closer I would give this to Musial, but I think even with Williams lacking the titles he was still better. 1950s, Mickey Mantle. The 1950s were arguably baseball's golden age, 3 teams in New York, stadiums packed to the brim, radios humming with play-by-play. And at the center of that cultural explosion was a switch-hitting phenom from Oklahoma named Mickey Mantle. Mantle erupted onto the scene in 1951 as a 19-year-old with thunder in his bat and rocket fuel in his legs. He was built like a linebacker, ran like a sprinter, and hit baseballs harder and farther than anyone had ever seen. He was supposed to be the heir to the great Joe DiMaggio, and somehow he surpassed the hype. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Early in his rookie year, Mantle blew out his knee during the World Series, chasing down a fly ball in right field, and it would haunt him for the rest of his career. But what makes his 1950s run so legendary is that even with that injury, he became one of the most electrifying players of the decade, and really of all time. So let's talk numbers. From 51 to 59, Mantle hit 280 home runs, drove in 850 RBIs, and posted a .975 OPS. He was a switch hitter who had both discipline and power, leading the league in walks 4 times and in slugging 3 times, and in 1956 he put together one of the most iconic seasons in baseball history. That year, Mantle won the Triple Crown. He batted .353, crushed 52 homers, and drove in 130 runs. He also led the league in runs, total bases, on base percentage, slugging, and OPS. And yeah, he won the MVP and led the Yankees to a World Series. And as for his team, they weren't just good, they were a dynasty. In the 50s, the Yankees went to 8 World Series, winning 5, and Mantle was there for all of it. He wasn't just part of the success, he was at the center of it, quite literally since he was a center fielder. By the end of the decade, he had more World Series home runs than anyone in history, a record he'd continue to build in the 60s. Now let's be clear that Willie Mays was right there. Pure talent, Mays might have had the edge. He hit for average, stole more bases, and played the best center field anyone had ever seen. And Stan Musial was still mashing in the early part of the decade too. But Mantle's combination of peak performance, raw power, switch hitting versatility, and sustained excellence all on the game's biggest stage makes him the defining player of the 1950s. He was the face of baseball and one of the most beloved ball players of all time. Even his name, Mickey Mantle, just sounds like the name of a star. 1960s, Willie Mays. By the time the 1960s rolled around, Willie Mays wasn't just a star, he was a living legend. He arguably could have been put as the best player for the 50s, and his 60s were nearly just as great. This was a decade where pitching ruled, ERAs were low, mounds were high, and hitters were at a disadvantage like never before. But Willie Mays year after year was dominating. But let's start with the basics. From 1960 to 1969, Mays hit 350 home runs, drove in over 1,000 runs, scored more than 1,000 times, and stole over 130 bases. He posted a .937 OPS in an era where the league average hovered around 700. But he wasn't just padding stats, he was winning awards. Mays made the All-Star team every single year in the 60s, won an MVP in 65, and finished in the top 6 in voting 8 times during the decade. That level of sustained excellence is almost unheard of. Even when he didn't win the award, he was always in the conversation. And we still gotta talk about the defense. Willie Mays wasn't just the best hitter of the 60s, he was the best center fielder in the world. He won 9 Gold Gloves in the decade, and they weren't just for show. Mays may have had his famous over-the-shoulder catch in the 50s, but he didn't slow down much in the 60s. He made the impossible look routine. He was charging line drives, scaling outfield walls, throwing out runners from the warning track. He turned defense into performance art. And then there's the leadership. Mays wasn't surrounded by all-star lineups like Mantle had been in the 50s. He played most of the decade for a Giants team that was good, but not great. They made the World Series once in 62, losing in 7 games to the Yankees, but Mays was the steady heartbeat through it all. Now sure, there were other legends in the 60s. Hank Aaron, who was the future home run king, is arguably still the home run king, was consistently elite and quietly racking up massive numbers. Roberto Clemente played a great outfield with great numbers, but by the end of the decade, Mays had become the standard for what a 5-tool player looked like. And even as the game tilted more towards pitchers, Mays never slowed down. He could beat you with the bat, the glove, the legs, the arm, or just by being better than everyone else on the field. 1970s, Joe Morgan. When people think about the 1970s, a lot of names come to mind. Reggie Jackson, Nolan Ryan, Johnny Bench, Pete Rose, but the player who quietly redefined the second base position and led one of the most dominant dynasties ever was Joe Morgan. Morgan wasn't the flashiest player, he didn't hit 50 home runs or throw 100 miles per hour, but what he did was win. He also controlled games in a way that few players ever could. He was the engine behind the Big Red Machine, the Cincinnati Reds dynasty that dominated the 70s. From 72 to 76, Morgan was on another planet. He won back-to-back MVPs in 75 and 76, putting up ridiculous on-base numbers, stealing 60 bags a year, and playing Gold Glove defense. In 1975, he had a .466 on base, and in 1976, .444. This guy got on base close to half the time and immediately became a threat to steal. The Reds won back-to-back titles with him in the middle of the lineup, and while guys like Bench and Rose were huge parts of that team, Morgan was the most complete player. Advanced stats love him too. His WAR in the 70s was off the charts and led all of MLB. You can make cases for Mike Schmidt or his teammate Johnny Bench, but Joe Morgan was doing everything. Walking, running, fielding, leading, and he was doing it better than anyone else. I was really close to choosing Bench here, but narrowly decided on Morgan. You can honestly go either way. They have very similar WAR, similar amount of at-bats, both won MVPs. Bench had a lot more power, Morgan had a lot more stolen bases. I'm honestly not 100% sure. I could go back and forth on who I think was the better player in the 70s, but you can't go wrong with either one. They're both all-time greats. 1980s, Mike Schmidt. If the 70s belonged to Morgan, the 80s belonged to Mike Schmidt, a power-hitting third baseman who was a defensive whiz and made the stadium erupt every time he came to bat. From 1980 to 1989, he won 3 MVPs, led the National League in home runs 6 times, and played elite defense at third base. He had range, a cannon arm, and soft hands. He wasn't a liability in the field, he was an asset. In 1980, he hit 48 homers, drove in 121 runs, won the MVP, and then led the Phillies to their first ever World Series title. That alone is legendary stuff, but he didn't stop there. He kept putting up 35, 40, even 45 homers a year, all while walking a ton and winning 6 Gold Gloves in the decade. Now, the 1980s weren't short on stars. Rickey Henderson brought chaos to the base paths, stealing more bases than anyone, and it's not even close. Cal Ripken changed the shortstop position. George Brett was a hitting machine. This really came down to Schmidt or Rickey, and they have practically the same WAR, similar games played, both won a World Series title and at least one MVP, but Rickey had 800 more stolen bases, while Schmidt won many more Gold Gloves and hit for more power. And just like with the 70s, you honestly can't go wrong with either one, and I'd love to hear what you all think in the comments. 1990s, Barry Bonds. There's no getting around it. Barry Bonds was the best player in baseball. And in the 90s, he hadn't even got into the cartoonish home run years yet. This was the most complete version of Bonds before the record books, before the inflated head, and he was a 5-tool monster. From 1990 to 1999, Bonds won 3 MVP awards in 90, 92, and 93. In that stretch, he hit for average, hit 30 plus home runs almost every year, stole 30 to 40 bases a season, and played Gold Glove defense in left field. He had seasons where he hit 336 with 46 homers and stole 29 bases, or hit 308 with 123 walks and a 600 slugging percentage. He was a sabermetric dream before sabermetrics were mainstream. And he wasn't just putting up video game numbers, he was doing it on winning teams. The Pirates made 3 straight NLCS appearances with Bonds in the heart of the order, and when he moved to San Francisco, he immediately led them to 103 wins in his first season. Yes, the starry conversation looms over Bonds, but in the 90s, he hadn't reached the peak of that era yet. This was the version that could do everything: hit, run, throw, field, and intimidate pitchers before he even swung the bat. There was plenty of stars in the 90s like Ken Griffey Jr. and Frank Thomas, but none were more dominant across the entire decade than Barry Lamar Bonds. 2000s, Albert Pujols. The 2000s were a decade of change. The steroid era was coming to a head, testing was introduced, and the sport was evolving into the more analytic, power-hitting game we know today. But while sluggers came and went, one man stood above them all: Albert Pujols. From the moment he debuted in 2001, it was obvious that Pujols was different. He wasn't just good, he was special. In his rookie season, he hit .329 with 37 home runs and 130 RBIs, and that wasn't his peak yet, that was the starting point. What followed was arguably the greatest first 10 years of any player in MLB history. Let's look at the numbers. From 2001 to 2009, Pujols never had an OPS under 955. He hit .331 for the decade, averaged 40 homers, 123 RBIs, and 117 runs per season. That's not just all-time great, that's inner circle Cooperstown type stuff. He won 3 MVPs in 2005, 2008, and 2009, and he could have easily won a few more. He finished second in MVP voting 4 times, and that's of course because Barry Bonds was completely dominant in the early 2000s. But it wasn't just stats. He was the heart of a Cardinals team that won the 2006 World Series and made multiple deep playoff runs. He was feared, respected, and consistent, and every time he came to the plate, you knew something could happen. And like I mentioned, Barry Bonds still played in the 2000s and was certainly better for the first half of the decade where he was having ridiculous seasons. But his dominance tapered off after 2004, and with all the steroid scrutiny, the baseball world looked to someone else. A cleaner face of power, a new standard, and Albert Pujols was that guy. You could also make a case for Alex Rodriguez, who had some massive years and hit for more power, but between the consistency, the postseason success, and the dominance across pretty much the entire decade, the 2000s belonged to the machine. 2010s, Mike Trout. The 2010s were the age of information. WAR became one of the most popular stats. It was launch angle, exit velocity, WRC+, and all of it became part of how we viewed players. But even with all those numbers and metrics, one name rose to the top almost every single time: Michael Trout. Trout debuted in 2011, and by 2012, he wasn't just good, he was arguably the best player in baseball at that point. From 2012 to 2019, Trout put up a 9+ WAR season in 7 out of 8 years. His 2013 season, 27 homers, 33 steals, 110 RBIs, and a .432 on-base percentage. In 2019, he hit 45 home runs in just 134 games with an on-base percentage over .440. He won 3 MVP awards in the 2010s, in 2014, 2016, and 2019, and he finished second in the voting 4 more times. Think about that. In an 8-year stretch, he was either the best or second best player in the league 7 times. But here's the kicker, he wasn't just racking up numbers in a vacuum, he was doing it while playing great defense in center field. He was a threat on the bases, and he did it all while playing for an Angels team that frankly didn't give him much help. He was next to the aforementioned Albert Pujols, but by this point he wasn't close to his 2000s self. The biggest knock on Trout is the lack of postseason success, but that's not on him. He barely got the chance, yet in a decade filled with sluggers, pitchers, and new school stats, Trout stood above them all. Miguel Cabrera deserves a shout-out as well. He won a Triple Crown and had monster years, but Trout's combination of consistency and just jaw-dropping production puts him in a class of his own. The 2010s were Mike Trout's world, and we were just living in it, and while he's often injured now, I hope we get a few more years of Mike Trout being an elite player. Now here we are at the 2020s, which is somehow halfway done. So the 2020s is obviously a two-horse race, and no one else is even in the same universe as these two players. On one hand, you have Aaron Judge, who is arguably the best right-handed hitter of all time. Excluding the 2020 Mickey Mouse season where he barely played, Judge has had two 11-plus WAR seasons and is on pace to have one again in 2025, although as of the time of writing, he is on the injured list. Most MVP winners have anywhere between 7 or 8 WAR, and Judge has already reached that before August this year. He broke the AL home run record, won 2 MVPs, and could very well win a third, and has been putting up offensive numbers we haven't seen since Bonds. But he isn't running away with the best player of the decade title because of Shohei Ohtani. Judge may be doing things right-handed hitters have never done, but Ohtani is doing things no player has ever done by being an elite hitter and pitcher. Although he hasn't pitched regularly since 2023, he won 2 MVPs as a hybrid player and then 1 as a DH in 2024. You really can't go wrong choosing either player, but going based on value, it's Aaron Judge. Judge's 2 best seasons have been more valuable than Ohtani's best, even when he was pitching, and while he is an elite pitcher when healthy, his offensive numbers aren't close to Judge's, and that's really saying a lot because Ohtani is probably the second best hitter in the league behind Judge. Judge is really in a world of its own when it comes to offense nowadays. And that's the video. Let me know who you think is the best player of each decade, if you agreed with my choices, if you disagreed. A lot of these I was really unsure about. I was asking people, getting different opinions, and I had to settle on one per decade, and some of them I really wanted to choose too. There's just so many great players in each decade that deserve recognition and that you can make different arguments for. But anyway, if you did enjoy this, be sure to subscribe, like, comment, and check out my other content. And like I said earlier, I'm going to be making a pitcher version of this, so if you have any opinions for that, if you want to let me know who you think the best pitcher per decade is, please let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching Baseball Domain, and I'll see you next time.